Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of CMEpalooza Spring, entitled What is Fair Balance Anyways? This session is sponsored by Haymarket Medical Education. I am Scott Cover, one of the co-producers of CMEpalooza, and I want to thank you for joining us for this session. We have co-moderators for the session. We have Amanda Steinmeier. Amanda is Senior Director of Educational Strategy at Med-Learning Institute, as well as Susan Yarbrough. Susan is a senior director at CME Outfitters, and they will introduce themselves, and the rest of the panelists will introduce themselves here shortly. So before we start, as we do with all of our CMEpalooza sessions, I want to thank our sponsors, our gold sponsors, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Education, Clinical Education Alliance, and Med-Learning Group. Our silver sponsors, Academic CME, DKB Med, Haymarket Medical Education, Helio CME, Platform Q Health Education, Red Med Ed, and Talem Health, as well as our bronze sponsors, Antidote Education Company, Bonum Continuing Education, CMEology, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Infograph Ed, Iridium Continuing Education, MedIQ, PriMed, PVI, RMEI Medical Education, Vindigo Medical Education, and Wright Medicine. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this and all of our CMEpalooza sessions. You can use the CMEpalooza text line, send the question to 277-660-CME0263. Tweet your question to us using the CMEpalooza hashtag. And what a lot of people are using today, and it's probably the easiest for us if you are watching this in YouTube, you can just enter questions in using the YouTube chat function, and they will show up, and I can pull them right up onto the screen in real time. But any of these 3 ways work for us. So we will be incorporating audience response questions during this presentation a lot. So we'll be using the Creative Education Concepts audience response system, which is Poll Everywhere. So you can either download the Poll Everywhere app and join the presentation entitled CMEpalooza 005, or type in the following URL in your web browser. So we have a lot of case studies throughout this presentation, so we're going to be using Poll Everywhere quite a bit. So please join us. And finally, our speaker disclosure slides. Please note that the opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. So with that, I am going to turn things over to our moderators, and to Lynn. I think Lynn is going to introduce our moderators, and then the rest of the panelists.
Hello, let me set up the way we're going to do this. I'd like to introduce you to Amanda, who is in a business development role at a medical education company. She is reaching out to her colleague, Susan, who is a director of accreditation and compliance at a different med ed company. Amanda has always relied on her accreditation person for guidance. Susan is also, though, her continuing education therapist. She brings her emotional water bottle in hand after a long day of work to discuss with Amanda an impromptu therapy session about this topic. Go. Welcome.
Before we get started, I would like to introduce our panelists. Lynn Schneider set the scene for us. Thank you so much. We have Priya Wanchu and Laurie Connor from BMS, who are going to be additional therapists for all of us as we tackle this tricky session. So Amanda, bring me your problems.
Yeah, I mean, so how we kind of came about this is, I think we all have those people that we call after a long day, or we're running into the challenges that we do, and we're trying to really come up with solutions. And so where we came into this is, I called Susan one time after getting a very large dissertation from a writer that included everything under the sun, and going, what am I supposed to do with this? I don't even know where to go with this. And as I tried to discuss things, with the writer, she said to me, well, don't you want to be fair balanced? And I'm like, of course, I don't even think that's in question. So I called Susan, and I'm having this conversation. I'm like, why would someone even ask me that? Of course that's the case, but that doesn't mean I have to include everything under the sun. And we began this whole discussion where I think in my quandary and therapy session, I was interchanging fair balance and fair and balance as kind of interchangeable terms. And it became this kind of nice conversation where we kind of started going, hey, wait a minute, let's separate those and let's really discuss the differences and nuances and where that has a place in what we're doing. And so, that's how we ended up here. So
sure. So to frame this conversation, I thought it'd be a good idea to, first, hypothesize or state that fair balance is not the same as fair and balanced. And we want to engage the audience and ask your opinions on a couple of different scenarios. These are kind of general. Let's not worry too much about, format and some of the, the other, of course, very critical components of how we build education, but kind of just want to set the scene and kind of gauge your thoughts as well as ours on fair balance versus fair and balanced, because they are the different things. Scott, can you advance the next slide, please? So we're going to put this scenario together to see what best fits your understanding of fair balance. So can you advance the slide? So I'm working on an online activity. I'm addressing therapeutic options for patients with diabetes. What do I have to do? And I'd love your thoughts to ensure that this is fair balance. I think I have a typo there. Just see that. And anyhow, so the first example in this, again, this online activity, you're going to address the GLP-1 agonist. You're going to talk about the risks, might have GI upset and other effects, the benefits, it may lead to weight loss, and you're going to talk about the new guidelines issued by a major medical society. The second example would be, again, for fair balance, I'm going to cover DPP-4 inhibitors, GLP-1 and dual GLP-1/GIP receptor agonist, SGL2 inhibitors, sulfonylureas, TZDs, insulin, as well as diet and exercise, physical activity, and nutrition. What do you think? See if we get more. Interesting. I love to see the change. This is great.
Yeah, and I think it's important too that we said that like this, we're not framing this with any particular framework too of the activity type, because I do think that that's a different discussion here.
Starting to balance out.
Wow.
Here. All right then. Trust me, we're going to talk about this. So that's really, really interesting.
Are we locking in? Oh, we're locking in responses.
A, 27%, where you're going to risks, benefits, guidelines. That's going to assure fair balance. Example B, all the therapeutic options, nutrition and physical activity. A lot of folks don't know. That's really fascinating. We'll talk about this some more. Or hey, team, let me check in before, or do we want to address it now?
Do we want to check in now?
Or should we use the next? Let's go to the next example. So again, this is for fair and balanced. Which scenario do you think fits best? Okay, we've got an educational strategy here for a rare disorder. I'm going to use the example for short bowel syndrome. What should be included to make sure this is fair and balanced? My first example, I'm going to make sure the areas I'm going to cover are growth hormones like somatropin, nutraceuticals like glutamine, and teglutide. Or am I going to just really, the second example, B, am I going to focus just on teglutide? And if I mispronounce that, my apologies on that. What do you think?
That seemed to have been a quick response. We're not wavering here. Oh, just kidding. I think we have internet delay. Yeah.
Yep, it takes a minute. Reflection is good. Think about it.
All right, and looks like we're locking in.
Okay, so example A is winning that there. Okay, great. Next slide, please. And then yet a third case, and we will be talking about these. Okay, so we've got, this is a first-in-class opportunity. It's a brand new, a recent discovery. It's gotten approved. Just for the record, I Googled first-in-class drug. I picked this drug at random, so it wasn't to target or identify anybody in particular, but it was just an example. So we have the opportunity to talk about this brand new therapeutic agent. It's got a new mechanism of action. It's being used to treat patients with thyroid eye disease, Graves' ophthalmopathy, which I mispronounced. But again, what am I going to make sure I should include when I'm talking about making this fair and balanced? Okay, the first example, I'm going to talk about corticosteroids, radiotherapy, the anti-IGF 1R monoclonal antibody, or am I going to focus on the teprotumumab? Again, some interesting, there's a little variety here. Leaning towards A, it's starting to pull out in front. Okay, great. So team, let's talk about these cases. Does anybody want to make any comments before we start talking about the actual definitions of these? Anybody got any?
I'm impressed that a number of people acknowledge that they don't know, because it is challenging.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point, because I think sometimes, when you're kind of going, is there a right answer? Is there a wrong answer? And where do we fall in between? So I think, exactly why we're having this discussion. I think it's helpful, that we have candid learners who are saying, I don't know, so that we can continue, discussing this. So
for sure. So we can have a better idea of what we're talking about here and the differences. I've said that there is a difference. Let's talk about those differences. So I'm going to ask Lori and Priya to kind of talk about the differences from their perspective of what these terms mean and to support her in the context of continuing education.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Susan. And also thank you to Susan and Amanda for organizing this event. I think it's important that we take time out of our day, of our year to really think about some of these types of questions in depth. And so I have the pleasure of giving you a definition for fair balance, and then Priya will talk about fair and balanced. And so first of all, fair balance is involved in an FDA law, or it was actually organized by the FDA, that requires that the product claim ads give fair, balanced information about both the drug's benefits and the drug's risks. And so what this means is that both the content and the presentation of a drug's most important risks must be reasonably similar. So I say most important risks reasonably similar. And so what does this mean for IME and fair balance in IME? And really, to us, risks and benefits is all about efficacy and safety. And so it's important in a fair balance program to have a discussion about safety and efficacy of all the drugs that are discussed in the program. And so, why do we need this? HCPs really need all of the information about all the different drugs that are going to be discussed in order to make informed decisions about a patient's individualized treatment plan. Okay. So Priya, do you want to talk about fair and balanced?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Lori. And again, thank you to Amanda and Susan for organizing this. So fair and balanced. I think if we're going to, if I were to choose just, simplify it, one simple way of differentiating fair, balanced and balanced to me deals with effective patient care, right? So like Lori said, fair balance are drugs, safety, and efficacy, but fair and balanced content it comes down to patient care. So the accredited providers are responsible for ensuring that the education is fair and balanced, and that the clinical content presented supports effective patient care. And then as per ACCME guidelines, all the recommendations for patient care in accredited continuing education, it has to be based on current science, right? So I think that's really important. It has to be based on current science, evidence, and most importantly, clinical reasoning. And that, what all of that feeds into while giving a fair and balanced view of diagnostics and all therapeutic options, right? So we're not just talking about drug safety and efficacy, but we're talking about clinical reasoning, right? This is the reason why I am diagnosing it this way based on X, Y, and Z. This is the reason why I'm picking this therapeutic option based on X, Y, and Z. So for me, I think it comes down to effective patient care and the content, which would make it fair and balanced.
Terrific. Thanks for running through that. Scott, can you advance the next slide, please? So we do have these definitions, and one's pulled from the FDA. Content and presentation of a drug's most important risks must be reasonably similar to the content and presentation of its benefits. Again, fair and balanced, and these are from the standards of integrity and independence. Reiterating what Priya just said, that clinical content supports safe and effective patient care. Current science, evidence, clinical reasoning, all of these things. So that's the context here. So let's go back and talk about these first three scenarios. And for everybody, I just have put it in the chat or have it available to show it is. So that first case, it's the addressing therapeutic options for patients with diabetes for fair balance. So I thought this was a fascinating conversation. So if we're going to be talking strictly about risk versus benefits, when I wrote this question, I was leaning towards A. I'd like to get your feedback and thoughts on this, ladies. What do you think?
I would agree with you. So I was leaning towards A as well, because fair balanced, again, if you're looking at purely the definition, we're talking about efficacy and safety, right? It's hard, depending on whatever therapeutic area that we're in. We can talk about this all day, whether it's diabetes or whether it's migraine or whether it's oncology, right? There are so many therapeutic options, and I think that's one of the challenges that we run into when we're trying to design the education, or when we're reviewing grants. How much is enough? How detailed do we get into it, right? And so I think I've seen so many different things, whether it's safety and efficacy. If there's 10 particular therapeutic options being discussed, you need to have the equivalent amount of slides, right? So you need one slide for efficacy, one slide for safety for all 10 drugs, so you're into 20 slides, right? So I've seen it, and not that happens, right? Because we want to be fair and balanced, right? But it's difficult, but I think that we can, whether it's first in class or whether it's all therapeutic options, I think we can be fair balanced without having to go through safety and efficacy data for every single drug, whether it's a table or something. I think we can simplify it as long as we present it.
I have a feeling we're going to be talking a lot more about this for sure.
Yeah, I will just follow Priya and just say, one of the things that I said in my definition was that, presentation of the drug's most important risks, right? Yeah. And so that's important, that you want to emphasize in the program, not every single one, but the ones that have the most impact or potential impact on the patient's quality of life.
Lynn, did you have something?
I did. I think the other piece that, and I'm bringing it up earlier than I intended, but I think the other piece to consider is, are we looking at developing a grant to show, as a medical writer, to show we have the knowledge to develop this program? We're looking at, are we talking about the actual program that we're developing, and how much time do we have? because a lot of programs are shorter, but we also make the assumption, I do as a medical writer, that most people coming into programs have basic level knowledge about the therapy, about the disease. And so reiterating 50 years of knowledge to provide fair and balanced, presentation of everything is unnecessary. So it's a question of, can we say we know what's happened in diabetes up until the newest agents have been developed, and this is why we needed to develop newer agents? Or do we have to reiterate everything and mention everything to show that we have that fair and balanced approach?
Excellent points. I think that's definitely some really great points there. Scott, if we can jump to case B, this is regarding the rare disorder, short bowel syndrome. So actually, I had a colleague share this example with me. This happened with her, and her challenge of, put together this activity, she was going to address all of these options, but her faculty felt had a really strong opinion on somatropin. I don't think is appropriate as an option I even want to talk about. I'm not going to talk about it. What would you do if your faculty said that to you when you're developing your activity?
Right. And these are the real world challenges we run into every day, right? So this is where, our CME colleagues as our therapists come into play, So what, let's talk about that. What do we do in those scenarios?
Yeah, I think when we were talking about this earlier today, I was shocked. I'm like, wow, that they said that. I look at it as an opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of that as well. So if that drug is not something that they particularly like to give, well, then this is their opportunity to explain why. So I think including it is important. Because everybody needs to hear about, again, risks and benefits of all of the different drugs in this class.
Lori, I think that's definitely the strong takeaway, is that if to push back and say, that's great, tell me why. You may have colleagues, people need to know why not to do something just as much as why to do something, right?
I agree completely.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah. Great example, and glad we had that. So first in class, again, I think we in the medical education company space, we do a lot of this too. Again, I think this is always a challenge on. So I think we're going to be getting to and as anybody knows me, I'll say this a lot: context is king. For an emerging if it's an emerging agent or first in class, how you're presenting this content is probably going to make a big difference. Yes? Who wants to talk about that?
Agreed. I think this is sticky. I mean, it's difficult. It's definitely difficult, especially if there is nothing available, right? Or there's first in class. It is difficult to be fair and balanced, right? But I think the takeaway would be focusing more on the unmet needs in treatment, like why there's a gap, and why it's of course it's a rare disorder, why it's difficult to treat. But I think for emerging age, even if it's just one new, it's like this is it. This is the only treatment option available, or just new phase 3 data, for example, in phase 2 and 3 for emerging agents. I think discussing the clinical implications of the data will balance it out, right? So we can always talk about what had been done in clinical practice, or the non-therapeutic options, if there are any, right? There's always, whether it's physical therapy or there's supportive care or something like that, making sure that, we do discuss that, but what the implications of this potentially new drug is, an only drug. I think that's okay, right? If we talk about it, if the KOL talks about it with, as in clinical experience and implications of the data.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, when you're developing a proposal, where do you start assuming what your audience knows? Does that give you a leg up on how much you have to talk about?
Yes. If you're talking about something that everybody knows. Most people know all the diabetes drugs that have been there. They've been out there for forever. And so you don't really need to go over all of the specifics of the past therapies that people should be familiar with. It depends on if you're doing a review. So if the project is a complete review, then you're going to go into everything. But if it's a targeted program, you don't have the need. And the way I look at it is you're telling a story. What is the story that you're telling? You have all these therapies that have been used. As Priya said, there's an unmet need that they are not responding to. Maybe they're not, corticosteroids are great, but they're not specifically indicated for a lot of, it's not your target. It wasn't developed specifically to treat that disease. So you want to tell the story of what was the unmet need with all of the agents that you have beforehand, and why is there a need for new medication or new device or new treatment strategy, whatever it might be. So I look at what is the story behind it, and where did we get to? Why is this education needed? That's the way I do it. That doesn't mean everyone does it that way.
No, it's valuable. Anybody else have anything on that before we progress on? Great. So again, just really kind of getting back to, but another big thing that I think that impacts this is microlearning. We have all seen through the pandemic, emerging all the different technologies, microlearning, getting just-in-time education, point-of-care education. I don't have time to spend at a 3-day conference. I just need it right here. But let's talk about, for our conversation first, what is microlearning? Lynn, do you want to tackle that a little bit?
Microlearning is a challenge for anyone writing it. It is clumps of anywhere from 5 to 15-minute programs that really target a specific topic or a specific therapy or a specific new guideline, whatever it might be. But we're not going through I've been in this field for over 30 years. So when I started in this field, we went through everything because we didn't have online learning, and we did, you were reading about everything that you needed to know, and we made the assumption that people didn't know. Now we make the assumption that people do know, and they only have a short period of time. We want to zero in on exactly what it is that they need to know about whatever this topic is in a very short, brief, but very targeted education.
Okay, got a couple more questions for the audience. If you want to advance, Scott. Can a microlearning activity offer fair balance when you're talking about a therapeutic agent? What do you think? This one's going to be interesting. I'm really curious about this one.
Yeah, those were some quick responses there.
Okay, everybody's leaning yes so far.
Yeah.
As it winds down, affirming, if nothing else. Hopefully it's a little biased there, but fascinating. Great. Okay. The next question. Can microlearning and can a microactivity offer fair and balanced views of therapeutic options? So again, we are looking at the nuances between fair balance versus fair and balanced. Be interesting to see if this data matches up. A little more variance here. Okay. Coming back a little bit more consistent, which we would expect a little bit. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Really, really interesting to see that. Can we go to the next slide, Scott? So thinking about in terms of microlearning. So again, more and more context here, because I think, we're always going to take that in consideration. So we've got an activity here. You're doing it, let's say, atrial fibrillation and abnormal heartbeat. We're thinking about fair balance and fair and balance. Where do devices come in? Is that an automatic inclusion if you're doing, agents and devices, everything else. Let's talk about that a little bit. But first, let's hear from you, the audience, and what do you think we should include? Do you include a device? Do you not include a device? To keep it fair and balanced for atrial
And there's so
fibrillation.
many, there are different therapeutic areas, but we're seeing wearables becoming more part of the solutions, kind of companions too. So I think we'll be watching those in some time more.
Okay, so leaning towards that it should be included. All right, let's pause here and let's talk about this case. So again, atrial fibrillation, kind of think it went a little bit when we were preparing for this, we were kind of expecting a little bit of conversation. So this is a therapy, a condition that has a lot of different options here. There is the medicine route with agents, and then there is a device route. Lynn, you had started and talked about a little bit this, and let's go ahead and jump in. Did you want to make a comment about this?
Again, it goes back to if we're doing microlearning or not, but either way, I think the question is, are we talking about, is the title the pharmacotherapies for AFib, or is it how do you manage AFib? Because there's going to come a time when you need to have a discussion about device with your patients, but the question is, do you need to do that upfront when you still have options that are less invasive? So it's more a question of what is the actual topic and what are the learning objectives of the program? Is it that you want to provide a comprehensive coverage of all the options, or can you get by with saying there are some patients who will require to have a device in addition to or in place of their pharmacotherapies?
Yeah.
Will that be sufficient?
I agree, Lynn. I think first just talking about the format about microlearning, it's great format, but I've seen it like in a series, right? So if you're doing like a series, whether like a quarter credit microlearning activity could say, for example, be a podcast, right? And it could be a series. So if it's a series, then we can have maybe as a larger, as a complete agenda, if you will, right? Topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, topic 4, that could be a fair balanced activity. And we could talk about, the therapeutic options and the device options and whatnot. Or if it's just a reinforcing activity, like here's your big, online curriculum, and then like a microlearning activity to kind of tie it all together. I think that we have to be really focused, right? And I think it's okay. Like if it's just reinforcing, say, a device, right? And I think if you have fair balanced the risks and benefits of the device, I think that's fine. And if you want to be fair and balanced, you can talk about the device, maybe another one that may be coming up in the pipeline, and then round it out with, implications for practice. But, I guess, but my point is that if we're going to do microlearning and fair and balanced, I agree with Lynn. I think the topic has to be very specific, because you're not going to be able to cover everything under the sun in a quarter credit activity.
You raised a great point, Priya. Thank you. So can we achieve the fair balance or fair and balanced in microlearnings if it's part of something larger, more than one, a series? Would y'all like to talk? I'd like to hear more about that.
I think it's a great comment, Priya, because a lot of the microlearning is it's an hour put into a bunch of smaller pieces, whether 15 minutes or 25 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever. So you can get a much more comprehensive program over the entirety of it. But if you're just doing one program, that's a lot more challenging to cover everything. You can mention it, but that doesn't mean you're going to give a full overview of all of the options that you have in that one program.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move on to the next case. So this is going to be this is designed to be a little bit broad, y'all, and Also, I think we're starting to learn quickly that there's no right answers. So if you're focusing on activity and say it's a complex area, say oncology, it's a therapy area where there are a lot of approved agents or agents, and yet you're designing an activity to focus in that one area. And if I can be broad enough, bear with me. But there's another agent, also FDA approved, but it's approved in another therapy area. There's clinical trial evidence. There's evidence-based, peer-reviewed, published data that supports that other therapeutic and just hasn't, But would you include that as part of your fair and balanced component of your activity, your learning? Do y'all have any thoughts about that? Oh yeah, let's ask the audience. Forgive me, we do have an audience again. So you've got FDA approval. There's a non-approved. It's approved agent, but in another area. How do you build that in? Is that an important consideration to make your content fair and balanced?
It looks like we might be split.
The no's have it.
Yeah.
Don't think it should be mentioned. Only stick within that class. Interesting.
Wow, that is.
Okay. So I've got a follow-up to this. So if there's the new therapeutic agent that's not approved, but again, there's peer-reviewed published phase 3 data. It's something brand new coming in. And you're talking about an area, again, where there are approved. Are you going to include that as a part of your fair and balanced component? I'd like to see what the audience thinks about this. Okay, stronger opinions here. So if it's something brand new, maybe a new mechanism of action or something along that makes it distinct, looking like folks are more inclined to include that there.
Yeah, I think I can just add here that, a lot of HCPs come to programs because they want to learn about the new thing that could possibly transform the treatment paradigm. And so, it is important to include things like that. Specifically, if you have the title being emerging agents, such. Exactly. Or one of your learning objectives says you're going to talk about emerging agents and things like that. So it is important. And, really some of the more seasoned HCPs, that's what they want to come hear about, because as others have mentioned, a lot of the other drugs have been talked about a lot at other programs. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think everything just needs to link together, right? So if the topic, from a learning perspective is emerging agents, and you have a learning objective and it's in the agenda, maybe even an outcomes measurement linked to it, I think it's fine. But if it's current treatments, say, for example, in short bowel syndrome, right? And then you just throw in emerging agents, the last 2 slides to make it fair balance, will it get under CME? Maybe, perhaps, right? But it just doesn't tie together from a learning perspective.
So we actually have a comment from coming in, that a lot of funders of education are those with novel phase 3 agents, and you better include them in your discussion of your within your program. So interesting paradigm about how does that affect support opportunities there? So again, have to from the compliance side, managing it to make sure it fits and it's meeting the rest of the standards. Yeah. Good question.
Can we go back to slide for one to the case where the agent is FDA approved in another therapy area, and most people would not include, but yet that may be the prevalent current treatment. I think of, I'll keep going to corticosteroids because they're used in so many different treatments. So you want to acknowledge that those are the current standard of care. or if there's an agent that is not necessarily indicated for your therapy, but it has been the therapy, as a standard of care, you do at some point have to acknowledge that and maybe talk about why it is no longer a top line or what the issues are that go back to the unmet needs. But I wouldn't completely ignore it, because that could be what we've been using for 20 years, and that most people have the most familiarity with.
Sure. Well, and the other thing that I was just thinking is when I'm designing activities, and especially if it's in a micro-learning environment again, am I going to be looking at my big picture portfolio or curriculum of what I'm offering in that therapeutic area to ensure I've got fairness, balance or not? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Is like, should I look beyond just my one activity then, or should I look at something bigger to make the claim I'm staying fair and balanced, by providing all these different opportunities? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Are you saying if you have 4 programs, are you
comparing
with one program versus the entirety of the programs?
If it's the small micro learning, but I've got this series, but then I know I'm going to have a monograph, and I know I have a a webcast there.
So multi-component. It's a multi-component activity. Okay. So they're all part of one initiative.
Right.
Got it.
It depends on the
that makes
learning
better
objectives.
sense. Yeah.
I think it would depend on the learning objectives for that micro component.
Sure. But just a thought that came through is does that help balance things out? Right. Scott, can we move on to the next? And Amanda, do you want to talk about the next case? Case 6?
Sure. So you're working on an activity in cardiology, say atherosclerosis. There's 5 FDA-approved statins, aspirin, stents, or even surgery. In an educational intervention for this healthcare team, not patients, do you address nutrition and physical activity? Yes, no, I don't know.
Even split. Okay.
Yeah.
I spoke too soon. Did I jinx the audience?
Yeah.
They're still. I think we're leveling off here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Most everybody would. Let's talk about this case. Amanda, what do you think?
I mean, so to the point, I think you would address that, but I think you have to consider a couple of things. You would address it because a lot of times, right, that might be part of guidelines where that's a companion to the therapy. So you would address it, but also I think we have to understand our audience too. So if our learners that are there for that activity, maybe that's part of that interprofessional team and that's not their role on the team. So would we spend a good portion of that activity talking about that? I'm not sure that would be the case. But I think you would be remiss to not bring it in, but I think the amount of time that we're addressing that would play a role. I think you would have to consider that.
Sure.
Yeah, I would agree with Amanda. I think it's a very large topic, but I think if it depends on who the audience is, if it's interventional cardiologists or primary care, I think we would have to tailor it a bit, because I think you have enough here, to be honest, to make it fair and balanced without it. But just for completion's sake, yes, you could, but I think it really depends on the target audience.
Excellent there. So yeah, I think there's some consensus there. So we've kind of run through some of these different areas, understanding that we're looking the nuanced difference between fair balance. See, I'm even making the mistake. Fair balance versus fair and balanced. Want to open it up for the audience for questions and a little more discussion. And if not, I've got a couple questions ready if we need them.
So I think some of the questions that we're getting are with the case studies is it depends. That it depends on what therapeutic area, what topics, what specific drugs. Is you're giving very general case studies, which you sort of have to, but it's going to vary depending upon whether you're talking about the treatment of diabetes or colorectal cancer, for instance.
And Scott, I think that absolutely nails on the head, is that there are no right answers, and context really is king. The goals of what your activity, the format is going to make such a huge difference, as we've already kind of touched on. If it's a small chunk of time you have your focus, it's going to make so much difference. So got a couple of different thoughts that I would like to hear. And Lynn, this one's for you. When you're writing, I know you do content development as well as helping prepare proposals. When you're writing a proposal, how much attention do you pay to fair balance versus fair and balanced?
It depends on if I'm looking at, my office is a mess. If I'm doing a needs assessment or if I'm doing the program itself, I want to mention what needs to be mentioned. It depends on what the learning objectives are. It depends on who the target audience is. And it depends on what kind of activity we're looking at. But I try to include at least an acknowledgement, go back to nutrition and physical exercise. Acknowledge that guidelines note that you must discuss physical exercise and diet with your patients who are diabetic. In addition to that, here are the therapies. So it really depends on what the topic is, what the audience is, what the learning objectives are, and whether I'm looking at doing microlearning, whether I'm looking at doing an entire, article, online program, our webinar. It really depends on all of the other parameters before you can just zero in on one over the other.
We do have a question that's come in. How does fair balance or fair and balance relate to equity?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Equity in the sense of
like health equity?
Yeah. Health equity. Just fair and balanced. How does that interplay? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think regardless, I'm like, whatever, health, they're patients, right? So I think it doesn't, in terms of the disease state, maybe prevalence data or incidence data, I think your content would change a little bit. But in terms of presenting specific treatment options or treatment plans, wouldn't change. I think they would need to be fair and balanced, but then again, specific nuances for a particular patient population to address a specific gap within that patient population would need to be added.
It's a different lens, I guess, to look at fair and balanced. If it's ensuring, when you're addressing, if it's social determinant health or other barriers, for example, it's a different lens to look at making sure you have the equity lens on to ensure all that the options available, are they available to every patient? Is that possible?
I think the issue to me is recognizing that there are disparities, and and just acknowledging that there are places that do not have access to this kind of care, and that determines what kind of care you're going to provide. Do you have the ability in a needs assessment or a program that's not specifically about disparities to get into the extent of the disparities? I don't think so. But you can acknowledge them and bring in, unless that's the specific learning objective, to bring in the recognition and at least educate that there are disparities, and you have to take into account that there are disparities and address that accordingly.
Sure. So this one is for Priya and Laurie. A couple of questions for you. How much do supporters look at fair balance versus fair and balanced when you're looking or evaluating what you'll support?
I think that
is a factor.
Absolutely. And in thinking about this question, I finally came up with, we want it all. right? We want fair balance, and we want our programs to also be fair and balanced. So, for fair balance, yes, we need our HCPs to understand the benefits and risks of a drug, but then we also want a fair and balanced program so that the HCPs know about all of the different drugs in a particular class, so that then they can make informed decisions about health care of their caring for their patients. So I think we want it all. Priya, what do you think?
I agree, Lori. Like, whether, it starts from the grant request to the agenda to the program. We do look for, like Lori's, fair balance and fair and balanced. But I think from the healthcare perspective, like, the content has to be relevant and it has to be applicable, because the feedback that we receive on evaluation, things like that, are like, it has to reflect what they are seeing in practice, right? So, for example, like, your atherosclerosis, your case study example, we'll have cases in the content. What particular treatment option would you choose, right? We have to make sure that those cases and those treatment options reflect what they're seeing in clinical practice. And I think that's something that we look for. I look for anyway in the, whether it's one particular drug or if it's current standard of care or it's even with emerging agents, is like, it has to address what the HCP is seeing like in day-to-day practice.
Great point. Oh, Susan, you're muted.
Susan, you are muted.
I am muted.
Everybody enter that on their bingo card.
Yeah.
Yep. You're welcome. Got that
It
covered.
wouldn't be a post-pandemic call without someone talking on mute. So.
Precisely. So the question that I had that came up a little bit before is that, and love Priya and Lori's opinions on, so if you're looking at a microlearning opportunity, are you looking for a proposal that's kind of micro too? I mean, are you expecting it to be a little bit more succinct, or are you looking to make sure that they can demonstrate that we really know our stuff when we're proposing a project? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Laura. You go ahead first.
I'm giggling because I think what you want me to say is that you want a
short proposal.
A short proposal. It'll take less work, right?
Be less for you to read. I'm just saying.
Right, exactly. I really, it's funny. When I read a proposal, I don't read it from beginning to end like a book, right? I actually go to, and other people do different things, but I go straight to the gaps, right? And I think that's really going to drive what the program looks like. So, do you need to give 5 pages of background when you have such a focused program? I would say probably not, right? Have the background be relevant to whatever the gap and the learning objectives are for the program.
I would agree. If it's a micro-learning activity, I'm assuming that it's, quarter credit, maybe a half a credit activity. I don't expect a 50-page proposal. But I think that upfront executive summary of, what is the gap, like Lori mentioned, and how this particular micro-learning activity is going to help close that gap by discussing X, Y, and Z information. And this is what the healthcare provider is going to walk away with. I think if it answers those questions and the 2 gaps or the 2 learning objectives that are going to be covered in that because I don't think we can get more than 2 objectives in a quarter credit activity. If that's laid out in a table, in a succinct table, I think that's fine.
Great. Yep. Brian McGowan, microlearning should be as long as needed, and so should be a grant proposal, and he's spot on. Everybody, I think we've hit pretty close to the end of the hour. I'm so grateful for your willingness to join in with this kind of tricky subject. Amanda, I hope this helps, gives you a little bit of therapeutic guidance on where to move forward. But you know, you can always call on me. I'm here for you. Again, thank you to Priya Wanchu, Lori Connor, Lori Schneider, Lynn Schneider, excuse me, Amanda. Very grateful for this. It was a great conversation. And Scott, thank you for everything. All
right. So thank you guys. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to everyone who has been watching. For those folks who are watching, whether it's the live recorded version, we have a very short survey at the bottom of the live tab on the CMEpalooza website. If you want your pet to complete the survey, that is also fine. It is only a few questions. And for those watching this live, there is no need to refresh your browser to view the next session. Just look on our live page and click the appropriate session link. It will start shortly here in about 4 minutes. So with that, I would like to thank Laurie and Lynn and Susan and Priya and Amanda for joining us. And we will see everyone soon.